like to take a very brief introduction of Mark, and everybody knows Mark. I mean, Mark has been around. He's one of the stalwarts. He's a pioneer in perfusion. He's perhaps the most well-published perfusionist in the world today. He serves as multiple editors on multiple journals. He's got credentials from a scholarly perspective that are unprecedented in the field of perfusion. He's been a perfusionist for over 40 years, and he was educated at Hershey Medical after receiving a Bachelor of Arts degree from Bloomfield College, that is in New Jersey, Bloomfield, New Jersey. But Mark has done remarkable research, both in the animal lab, clinical research. Nobody knows more about safety in perfusion and has published more on it than Mark has. He has over 100 peer-reviewed publications, almost half his number of textbook chapters, and he serves as memberships and leadership roles in many societies, including the American Heart Association, the Association for Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, the American Society of Artificial Organs, where he's been involved with that for 45 years now, and AMSEC since he became an AMSEC member in 1972. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Mark, and Mark is going to present. The title of his presentation is May 6, 1953, Operative Report, Closure of a Large Interatrial Septal Defect, Easily Closed. So with that, Mark Kurusz.
Thank you very much, Al. Can you see my title slide? You're able to see the title slide, is that correct?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. Well, appreciate the invitation to tell you a bit of history today, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are. It's unlikely that this talk will have any practical implications for clinical practice, but I think it's fascinating to look back 70 years now on one of the most extraordinary cases in the history of medicine. The second goal tonight is to honor the pioneers and heroes of that case. And a third goal is to convince you that scholarship will lead to insights. And this is a subject I've studied for quite a long time. I hope you agree. Now, why is this not advancing? Okay, sorry. So I'd like to reverse the order a bit and first acknowledge all the sources that I accessed to put this talk together. First and foremost are the archives and special collections at Thomas Jefferson University, and in particular, Mr. F. Michael Angelo, who provided access to all the John Gibbon records on this case. Secondly, the National Library of Medicine, Dr. Paul Thierman. There's a large collection of John Gibbon papers held in Washington at the National Library of Medicine. And perhaps most importantly, two individuals who were in the operating room that day, Dr. Bernard J. Miller and Mrs. Joanne Crothers DeLone, were invaluable. I had the pleasure of interviewing them several times over the course of gathering this information. Others that I interviewed included this list. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Ada Romaine Davis. She wrote, I think, the definitive story of Dr. Gibbon's work to perfect the heart-lung machine. It was published in 1991. There were a number of surgeons that I interviewed: Dr. Victor Greco, John McEwen, Rudolph Commission, Anthony Dobell, John Templeton, Robert Finley, and finally Harris B. Schumacher, who was a great personal friend of Dr. Gibbon and his wife, and who has also published a book on Dr. Gibbon's quest to perfect the heart-lung machine. Unfortunately, or sadly, all these people are now deceased. But anyway, I will tell you the story now. So what happened in 1953, the spring of 1953? Well, there was a lot going on. First of all, the molecular structure of DNA was discovered, and as you all know, Doctors Watson and Crick were awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine that year for their discovery. Mount Everest was conquered in May 1953. Queen Elizabeth II was coronated in May 1953. And on the technological front, the 1953 Corvette was produced. There were only 300 of them made that year. They cost $3,500, which was a huge amount of money back in 1953. And one recently sold at an auction for nearly $500,000. And of course, on the medical side of things, the heart-lung machine was used for the first time successfully on May 6, 1953. Well, the first report was actually in the New York Times 2 days later, and it was entitled "Heart's Job Done by New Apparatus." And it reported, quote, "Surgeons close hole in empty organ while circulation is maintained mechanically." A few days later, in Time magazine, there was a longer article entitled "Historic Operation," with an interesting photograph of a huge machine that you can see there in the center of the article. The article began, quote, "Nothing has been nothing has been dearer to the surgeon's heart than the dream of a machine to replace the heart by pumping a patient's blood during an operation." Now, the photo that's shown in that article in Time magazine shows Miss Joanne Crothers, who was a lab technician who worked with Dr. Gibbon right out of high school when she was 17 years old. She worked in his laboratory beginning in 1947. And apparently Dr. Gibbon was a little shy and did not want to pose for the article. So Joanne was tasked to appear in the Time magazine article. However, as you read the article, Dr. Gibbon says, quote, "The machine is not a cure-all for all heart conditions. It will probably be used chiefly on patients born with a deformed heart. It can't help coronary artery disease or hearts crippled by diseases of old age. But now, for the first time, it is possible to look into the heart. It's sort of like drying out a well to do some work at the bottom of it," end quote. You might notice too that on the left side of that article, a leading New York doctor told his patients what to smoke, namely filtered Viceroy cigarettes. Just sort of curious. So really, I hope to answer two questions during the talk this evening. And that is, first, how did the Gibbon IBM Model 2 heart-lung machine work? And secondly, what really happened on May 6, 1953? As noted, sources for this presentation are published reports, medical records, and eyewitness accounts. Now, it might be useful, I hate to belabor something that's obvious to all the perfusionists watching this webinar tonight, but what are the goals of perfusion? Well, provide blood flow, maintain the patient's blood pressure, provide adequate gas exchange, maintain adequate blood volume, and certainly prevent blood clotting. Well, dreaded events during perfusion are decreased blood flow, prolonged hypotension, hypoxia, acidosis, loss of circulating volume, and finally, one of the most dreaded complications is clotting in the cardiopulmonary bypass circuit. Well, as we shall see in the next several minutes, all of these occurred during Dr. Gibbon's famous case. And the fact that they occurred really weren't well appreciated for decades. Everybody thought, well, this was really a pretty straightforward closure of an ASD. But I hope to show you it was not as simple as that. So what did Dr. Gibbon initially have to say about the case? Well, as noted earlier, he was notoriously reticent in, initially anyway, describing his experience using the heart-lung machine. In the late 40s, there had been some articles in Life magazine. Joanne was pictured in one of the articles on the work he was doing to perfect a heart-lung machine. However, the first scientific report of the May 6th case didn't appear till nearly a year later, and it was in an obscure Midwestern journal called Minnesota Medicine. Dr. Clarence Dennis, who was another early cardiac surgeon pioneer, had to really coerce Dr. Gibbon to come up and present his experience in developing heart-lung machines, which he did, and he described 4 cases. It's likely that Dr. Gibbon performed 6 or 7 cases using the heart-lung machine, but those additional cases besides the 4 that were described in this article were never published. The one he did report in this article is the one we're all going to, that we're all familiar with, and I'll tell you about it now. So what did he say in the Minnesota Medicine report? He said that, well, he said very little actually regarding the perfusion or much about the surgery. He said that the patient was connected with the apparatus for 45 minutes. Well, in fact, it was for 48 minutes. And furthermore, that all cardiorespiratory functions were maintained by the apparatus for 26 minutes. We'll see from the notes taken during the case that there were some inconsistent times reported in handwritten notes during the case, and we'll go through those in just a moment. This is a statement that summarizes the case, and I think it's the reason I titled this talk with easily closed was, from a surgeon's perspective, it may have been easily to accomplish the surgery, but quite the opposite was going on at the other end by those operating the heart-lung machine. What he said was she had a large interatrial septal defect, which was quite easily closed with a continuous silk suture. Again, not much details about how they actually ran the heart-lung machine. And during a congratulatory telephone call after the surgery, Dr. Clarence Dennis called Dr. Gibbon and congratulated him. And Dr. Gibbon replied, quote, "After we finally got ready, it was ridiculously easy," end quote. Well, that assessment, I don't think, was entirely true, as details of the operation have come out. This is a famous photograph. I'm sure many of you have seen this. This is a photograph that was taken by Dr. George Hopt, one of the surgical residents, who held a small camera above his head and snapped a picture that shows Dr. Gibbon. Opposite him is Dr. Frank Albritton. The person standing here to Dr. Gibbon's left is Dr. B.J. Miller. And the 4th surgeon, which is not shown, was Dr. Thomas Nealon, but who was scrubbed in. And there are 4 surgeons noted on the operative report as having been scrubbed in. It's interesting to note that May 6, 1953 was a hot day in Philadelphia, and Dr. Gibbon had the windows to the operating room opened so a breeze could come in and keep everybody cool during the operation. Kind of amazing. Other personnel who were in the OR that day were Miss Kitty Rowlands. She was a nurse anesthetist. There were no anesthesiologists on staff at Jefferson Hospital in 1953. The heart-lung technician, as I had mentioned, was Joanne Crothers, and she had worked with Dr. Gibbon really for the last 6 years, right out of high school. The residents who I had mentioned earlier were Dr. George Hopt, Victor Greco, Robert Finley, John McKeown, and Anthony Dobell. And finally, and most importantly, Mally Gibbon, Dr. Gibbon's wife, who had worked with him tirelessly, really for 2 decades to help perfect the heart-lung machine. You may remember they began working on cats that they would go out in the streets of Boston at night and collect cats in the effort to be able to totally occlude the pulmonary artery. Well, Mally sat in the corner taking notes during this case because they anticipated that if it was successful, there would be a press conference later, but this never happened. But fortunately, her notes were preserved. This is another photo I wanted to share with you. It shows the laboratory group, and they're working on a dog. That's Dr. Miller, shown here. Immediately to his left is Joanne and 2 other nice ladies. It may not be totally visible. Well, first of all, they look very happy for some reason. I don't know. The dog prep must have been going very well that day, but you can't really see this, but the women, in fact, are wearing pearl necklaces, which I found sort of unusual attire for the dog lab. So, as to the famous operation, May 6, 1953. Patient was an 18-year-old female. She was a college student from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. She had been hospitalized 3 times in the preceding several months for severe right heart failure. She had had a cardiac cath performed that demonstrated a very large 9 liter per minute left to right shunt. She was barely able to climb a flight of stairs. On the day of surgery, a needle was inserted into her right brachial artery and connected directly to a mercury manometer to measure her blood pressure. And she had 2 IVs in both of her ankles placed for administration of fluids. Continuing on with the operative report, the patient was given morphine and atropine as pre-meds, but the primary anesthetic was thiopental sodium. And this became very important during the course of the operation. Only 10 milligrams of heparin were administered to the donor units that had been used to prime the machine. It said that they would line up 8 to 10 to 12 people to donate fresh blood prior to cardiac surgery. And for some reason, only 10 milligrams of heparin were administered to the donor units instead of the normal 25 milligrams, as they had done on virtually all the previous animal experiments. The patient had a transverse chest incision. The median sternotomy that we're all familiar with had not yet been invented. And I think it's curious that in the anesthesia record anyway, there's no documentation of heparin being given to the patient, but it clearly was, because protamine was administered at the end after they came off bypass, and the operative note does say that heparin had been administered, most likely by the surgeon, as we sometimes have seen back in the day, instead of the nurse anesthetist. Continuing on with the operative report, the first thing they did to cannulate was to expose the left subclavian artery. They did this with some difficulty, but they were able to insert a small section of tubing into the left subclavian. They had to divide it, actually. And then they cannulated the inferior vena cava via the right atrial appendage and the superior vena cava via the right atrial wall. After they got exposure and were ready to go on bypass, note was made in the operative report that the patient's pulmonary artery was huge and the right atrium was greatly dilated. Partial bypass was started, but almost immediately a blood leak developed from the top of the oxygenator. They inserted a left ventricular apical vent, primarily to avoid air embolism whenever the chambers of the heart are open. And this had been learned through all their animal experience. If they put apical vent in the left ventricle, they could avoid systemic air embolism. Total bypass was established once the tapes on the SVC and the IVC were cinched down, and then they closed the atrial defect with running suture. I should have mentioned earlier, they really weren't sure until they went in that the patient had an atrial septal defect or a ventricular septal defect. But anyway, it turned out to be atrial, as we now know. After the operation, they reestablished partial bypass and removed the vent. And the heart at that point, for probably because of the acidosis hypoxia, was fibrillating. They shocked it once, no change. They shocked it a second time, and the patient was converted to normal sinus rhythm. Now, this is, again, courtesy of the Scott Memorial Library. This is the actual anesthetic record for that case. What I've done, because there's a lot on this 8.5 by 11 record, is I've split it into 3 parts. The very top part, one of the first things you see is that whoever was creating this record misspelled the patient's last name. They wrote Bivolac, when in fact it was Bavolek. Importantly, anesthesia began at 9:10 in the morning and ended at 1 p.m. However, the operation, which began 30 minutes after anesthesia was begun, the operation didn't end until 2:50 in the afternoon, which is almost 2 hours after anesthesia was stopped. This is the graphic portion of the anesthetic record. And what we see here, I've highlighted respirations, and they were dutifully recording respirations until some problems developed, and they simply wrote some question marks down here. More ominous is blood pressure, highlighted here in yellow, and you can see that a good portion of the period until they got the patient off bypass, they either weren't able to measure a blood pressure or they were just so preoccupied trying to get through the operation. There was just no blood pressures noted. Her blood pressure was very, very low for quite a few minutes during this procedure. And finally, at the bottom of the anesthesia record, diagnosis, interauricular septal defect, somewhat antiquated term. We call them atrial septal defects now. The operation was closure of the septal defect. And I think it's interesting to note that remarks on condition of patient and treatment during operation, and what they wrote was fairly good. And it says here that 1,500 cc's of blood were administered during the case. You can see that 100 milligrams of protamine were given to reverse the systemic anticoagulation. And the good news is the sponge count was correct. 60 going in, 60 coming out. Now, there's another famous drawing that I'm sure many of you have seen. This is from an article that B.J. Miller wrote in 1982, and it very nicely shows the arrangement of the Gibbon IBM heart-lung machine. What I'd like to point out is that, at least in this diagram, there were 3 roller pumps. A venous pump. Back in 1953, they had assisted venous drainage, believe it or not. They had a recirculation pump here, shown as E. And then the systemic pump is P. Now, the way this oxygenator worked, there were 8 screens encased in a lucite chamber, clear lucite chamber. And by the way they sterilized this whole apparatus was to soak it in Zifferan for several hours and then rinse it with up to 40 liters of saline to get all the antiseptic solution out of it. They couldn't autoclave anything. So the other thing to point out is that there was a servo regulation here for the venous pump, that if they were operating this pump and they collapsed the KV, the sensor here would detect that and either slow down or stop the venous pump. So that's number one. And they also used a level sensor. You can see that, here's the level sensor, that if the reservoir level got too low, that was servo regulated to the systemic pump and it would shut off the systemic pump. Interestingly enough, the only way they could add fluid or blood to this circuit was through a small burette designated A here, which was placed before one of the venous pumps. And again, Dr. Gibbon was a bit ahead of his time. He did use a screen arterial filter, although the mesh was 300 microns porosity. So how did they set up and operate this machine? Well, Joanne and Dr. Greco had been charged to operate the heart-lung machine. The machine was brought up to the 4th floor operating room early in the morning, primed in this fashion. They pre-wetted the 8 screens with saline and then quickly chased that with whole blood prime. The key to the way the screen oxygenator worked was to maintain a film at all times so gas exchange could occur. And to do that, the recirculation pump was continuously operated to maintain the blood film. Well, they prepared the pump very early on the morning of this surgery, and it was recirculating this less than adequately anticoagulated blood for several hours before the patient was connected to it. The venous pumps, as I mentioned, and there were 2 of them, were servo regulated to venous flutter valves, again, to prevent collapse of the KV, because that would prevent venous blood being transported into the oxygenator. And once again, the arterial pump was servo regulated to the blood reservoir level. The gas composition was 95% oxygen, 5% CO2. And quite amazingly, I'm not sure we even have this today, but the gas flow was servo regulated to a blood pH meter, and it would automatically adjust the gas flow depending on what the blood pH was. As mentioned earlier, there were high pressure sensors with pump cutoff for both the recirculation and the arterial pumps. And not surprisingly, as is commonly used today, 300 millimeters of mercury was considered the upper limit for stopping those pumps. If that was exceeded, the pumps would stop. They struggled in the animal lab to have a heat exchanger, but they never really perfected it, so there was no heat exchanger during the May 6 operation. So again, going back to the operative report, and this is Dr. Gibbon's words, and he said, during the 26-minute period when the machine was carrying the entire circulation, there occurred a progressive decline in the oxygen saturation of the arterial blood. Well, the reason for this was that the donor units had started clotting on the oxygenator screens. It's still a mystery. I think that 25 milligrams was ordered, but for some reason, the blood bank personnel did not fully anticoagulate the fresh whole blood. According to eyewitnesses that I've spoken with, they said the blood was black. I'll show you the oxygen saturations in just a moment. I wanted to show you one other diagram because on May 6th, there were actually 2 venous pumps, one for the superior vena cava, one for the inferior vena cava. Once again, here's the little burette. This is the only way fluid or blood could be added to the circuit. Here is the cutoff. If the pressure got too high in the recirculation pump, it would clamp down, and so no blood would then be delivered into the oxygenator reservoir. Now, these are some of the actual notes, and there are at least 12 sheets held at the Scott Memorial Library that I was able to get. And I'd like to show you some of the comments that were made. These were written by Mally Gibbon. And the first thing you note on one of them is that the filming was excellent. One rivulet noted. So they're very happy early on before the patient was put on bypass. And at 11:25, they took a sample for pH and hemolysis, and everything looked fine. Well, at 12:52, the patient was put on partial bypass. That's noted right here. You can see it's scratched out. I don't know if it's 12:52 or 12:53. I mean, you can imagine she's taking notes, trying to see there. The room was full of people. A lot of people in the room that day, according to Dr. Miller. Well, at 4 minutes later, at 12:56, they went on. They cinched down the tapes on the inferior vena cava, and this established total bypass. But what transpired almost immediately was leak in lung. This is not a good thing. They never had this in the animal laboratory, but Dr. Gibbon, conferred with Dr. Albritton and said, well, we're going to go ahead and close this defect. So at 1:07, they went on total here at 1:07. Another set of notes. It's noted large leak in top of lung, attempts to stop leak. Right here it says attempt to stop leak, and they're adding blood. They had some bank blood to give, and then more ominously at 1:15 they lost the film on screens 1, 2, and 3. Now remember, there were only 8 screens. Well, they lost the film on 3 of the screens. Well, about that point they said, well, we better get a blood gas. Things were starting to not go well from the perfusionist perspective. At this point, Dr. Miller said to BJ Miller, who was scrubbed in, BJ, do something. So Dr. Miller broke scrub and went over and took control of operation of the heart-lung machine. The next several minutes really were a perfusionist nightmare. This is, I think, the final set of handwritten notes. At 1:28, the automatic shutoff was pinched closed. That's for the recirculation pump. This is not a good thing. Here they're continuing to give more blood, 100 cc's, 100 cc's. And with all pumps shut down, Dr. Miller, who was very familiar with the entire circuit, bypassed the recirculation pump. It's not clear from me in speaking with him or from any of the records. He must have inserted a new section of tubing and connected it directly to the arterial pump, proximal to the arterial pump. Well, this allowed blood then to drain into the oxygenator reservoir that had been depleted. So there were 2 problems. There was high pressure that stopped the recirculation pump, and the low level shut off the arterial pump. So it was not a good situation. So Dr. Miller hand cranked for the last several minutes of the case, but he was not delivering oxygenated blood. He was delivering venous blood because the oxygenator had been malfunctioning. Dr. Albritton, who was first assisting Dr. Gibbon, said, well, you probably ought to abandon your original thought of using a pericardial patch and just close this defect with running suture, which Dr. Gibbon did. Things were so dire, and I'm sure Dr. Albritton was urging Dr. Gibbon, you know, we need to get this patient off bypass, that they actually put a Satinsky clamp on the atrium in order to wean the patient off bypass. And at 1:43, off machine, no doubt to the relief of everybody in the room that day. Now, after the case, this became the official record for Cecilia Babalek. It was typed up a few days later, probably by Joanne. Here again, you know, the record shows 26 minutes. Here it says it's 27 minutes of total circulation. And there's times, events, blood flow rate, blood given, and blood pressure. So again, 108, things are already going bad. They then went on bypass just a few minutes earlier. Attempts being made to stop huge leak in top of lung to no avail. The next section of this typed record shows asterisk at the top, asterisk at the bottom. This is the period when the patient was on total bypass, which again is either 26 minutes or 27 minutes. The first blood samples were taken here about 1:15. I'll show you those results in just a moment. Here is the blood flow. This column again is showing all the blood that they're administering during the crisis. Sorry. And the other thing that developed later in the perfusion was, you can see it says too much suction in coronary return, vein pump unable to empty chamber. I mean, it was, again, not to belabor the point, this was a perfusionist nightmare. This is the tail end of the typed record. They took another set of blood gases, and I'll show you those results in just a minute. The whole time they tried to keep the recirculation pump going, but it was not a good situation, not a good situation at all. So what I've done with those handwritten records and the typed records is, with our medical illustration department at the university, I created this graphic that I think should be to more easily understand what they were dealing with. The two gray areas on this graph show the periods of partial. The light gray is the period of total bypass. The blue line shows the, what does the blue line show? That shows flows. And then you've got some yellow X's that are showing blood pressures. And you can see there's like a 20-minute gap where there were no blood pressures at all recorded. More importantly, look at all the blood that was given, 100 cc's, 100 cc's, 100 cc's. I mean, right on through, by my tally, they gave over 2 liters of blood during this case. The asterisks denote, in the first instance, the huge leak was discovered almost immediately after going on bypass. Attempts made to stop the leak to no avail. Victor Greco, in fact, had to stand up on a stainless steel stool and hold the lid on the oxygenator. It's a closed lucite case. They were so fearful that the high pressure would blow the lid off the oxygenator. It was just a nightmare for those in the OR. But again, they finally came off here at 1:43. Protamine was started. And interestingly enough, because of what was going on with the perfusion, all anesthetic drugs were stopped more than an hour before the end of the surgery. And in fact, the patient, Cecilia Babalek, woke up when they were putting skin sutures in. And there was great concern because of the acidosis, hypoxia. You know, what would her neurologic status be? Were her kidneys going to be functioning? But amazingly, later that evening, when she was in recovery at 9 p.m., one of the residents, I think it was Dr. Dobell, noted that she was completely lucid and making good urine. Here are the blood gas results from the famous case on May 6th. They took 2 samples again, one about 1:15 and then second set really during the crisis. So what you see here is pH went from normal, 7.41 before going on pump down to 7.32, 7.31. At the end of the case, she was down to 7.20. More ominous, if you look at the O2 saturations, started out, well, I'm sure they were using a Van Slyke, and I mean, it couldn't have been 102.8% saturated pre-bypass, but look at the saturations here during the crisis, 56.7 for arterial, and then even later, 31.8%. As noted, some of the eyewitnesses said the blood was black. It was awful. So I got one more photograph to show you. A lot of people think this is a photograph taken during the historic operation, but in fact, it was taken several months later in the dog lab. It shows Dr. Miller and Dr. Dobell operating on a dog. Joanne Crothers not only ran the heart-lung machine, she scrubbed in. This is Joanne here on the far right. And the person standing before the machine, the Gibbon IBM machine, was a medical student who was recruited to, kind of pose for this picture. I think the interesting thing on this photo is that this is the cardiotomy suction system. They never anticipated that there would be a lot of cardiotomy suction blood, and this was really an afterthought to the entire apparatus here that, quite frankly, cost nearly $750,000 in today's money for IBM to build this Model 2. So again, in the lay press, this was published 25 years after the operation. It shows a picture of Joanne post-operatively being tended to by a nurse. There's a wonderful quotation in which she said, "On that morning, I knew things could only go one way. Call it a youthful hunch, a teenager's female intuition, or whatever. I felt it would go my way with Dr. Gibbon's machine and lots of prayers," end quote. Well, she only knew. She actually had been offered the option of inflow occlusion with hypothermia to close the ASD. And as you all probably know, there were a lot of ASDs being closed using that technique, not with a heart-lung machine, but simply cooling the patient down, occluding the cavity, going in quickly, closing the ASD, and then getting out. But she said she couldn't stand the idea of being frozen and opted instead for the heart-lung machine. This is another famous photo showing Joanne 10 years later when she was the Heart Fund Queen, chosen by the American Heart Association with then Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Also that year in the Sunday Bulletin magazine, there's a long article, and it said, quote, Cecilia Babelec's surgery, or Cecilia Babelec's case made medical history, but today she's just a normally healthy young woman. Now, Cecilia did not like all the publicity and the inquiries about her surgery, especially after one lady came up to her and said, "Oh, you're the young girl who they sawed in half." And she really retreated from any publicity. As far as I can tell, and there's some documentation again from the Scott Memorial Library, she worked as a secretary and later became a medical technologist at Hahnemann Hospital. And Cecilia died in the early 2000s, but far outlived any patient with the serious pathology that she had. And So that is really the story of the first successful use of a heart-lung machine for a surgical procedure that today we think is fairly simple, but it was far from simple on that day, in that fateful day, really, in May 1953. And again, as I've researched this, I think it's really a tribute to Dr. Miller, who took over and really saved the day. When I interviewed Dr. Miller for a meeting that was held in 2003 on the 50th anniversary, I asked him, how was that case? And he said, well, he acknowledged that a catastrophe was very, very narrowly avoided. And I want to just show you one other photo. I had the great privilege to meet with Dr. Miller, stayed with his family one night in 2004. And you can see from this photo in 2004 that he still was a bit shy. He had a workshop. This was down in the basement of his house. And he really was an extraordinary individual, revered by his children. 3 of his 5 children became physicians. And I just had, again, one of the highlights of my career was meeting Dr. Miller and really getting to know him, his wife, his son, and really know what happened during the surgery. So that really concludes my talk, Al. I will end the share slides right now and turn it over to you.
Mark, I just want to say it was a fantastic presentation. Yeah, you hear a lot how well things went, and it's nice to get a bird's eye view of how it really happened. And I'm sure all of us had many experiences with cases that way. Out of curiosity, I just want to ask, how did you make contact with Joanne Carruthers?
Well, that's an interesting question. Very, very briefly, in 1974, there was an article in the Journal of Extracorporeal Technology, the AMSEC journal, and Grady Holman, a surgeon in Houston, had her name. It was Joanne Carruthers DeLone, and he noted that she lived in Bloomington, Indiana. So quite simply, I called directory assistance and I reached Joanne by telephone. I spoke with her a number of times. She was very modest, but very friendly. And that was really how I got to know her. The other kind of icing on the cake was that I'd been talking with Dr. Miller, and I got the two reconnected 50 years after the event, and they had a wonderful time reminiscing just between the two of them about that case. Joanne married a professor of music at Indiana University and moved out there. But it's interesting, Joanne passed away about 18 months ago, and in her obituary, it clearly says she was the perfusionist on the first successful use of a heart-lung machine. So obviously a very important event in her life.
That's amazing. Mark, this was phenomenal, and I'm not going to read you all the accolades that you've got for people coming in the Q&A, but one thing was this wasn't something you just put together by searching the internet. You traveled to Philadelphia and Thomas Jefferson. Can you tell us how easy it was to obtain these records and how quickly you were able to get permission from the president of Thomas Jefferson?
Well, I had doubts that they'd ever, I mean, if you go to the Scotland Royal Library, Michelangelo will say, well, here's the box of the Gibbon records, and they have, a modest collection of stuff. But then getting permission to make copies did take a letter to the president of the university, and it took them 18 months to allow Mr. Angelo to send me them. So yeah, it wasn't easy.
And what perseverance, and what a great opportunity. You are such a natural when you discuss these things, but I'm sure the amount of work that went into the background. Mark is also one of the leaders of AMSEC's history committee with Kelly Hedlund, Gary Griss, Bob Groom, and a few others. So, you know, these guys, what Mark is doing and others is just remarkable to preserve this for us. So I thank you on behalf of everybody who's been writing in the Q&As. If you don't mind, Jeff, I'm just going to ask Mark another question that's not in my mind, and you might have mentioned this, and I'm sorry if I missed it. Why IBM? Who approached who with the idea to fund and build the heart-lung machine?
You know, I've read about that. I don't know all the details, but at some point, Dr. Gibbon got hooked up with Thomas Watson, who was chairman of IBM at the time. And I guess Thomas Watson was intrigued by the idea of what Dr. Gibbon was trying to build. And he committed at least 2 engineers full-time to build this. This was the one that was used on May 6th was the Model 2. The Model 1 actually had 2 huge consoles. It was a rotating cylinder and just didn't have the oxygenating capacity. So they went to the Model 2. And then the one that was used in subsequent years was really the Model 3, which was cannibalized with parts from the Model 2. The Model 2 does not exist. They had a mock-up of it in Philadelphia at the 50th anniversary meeting. They had a mock-up of the original Gibbon IBM Model 2. It's huge. It's really like just huge, massive oxygenator or console.
Mark, Jennifer Barnum asked a question. She wants to know if these records by any chance have become or are a part of the Library of Congress for preservation.
Well, the National Library of Medicine has a much larger collection of John Gibbon material. And again, it's accessible. You know, you show your driver's license and they will let scholars or interested people look at the records. I mean, it's been a while since I've been up there, but yeah, most of the stuff is at the National Library of Medicine, but for the May 6th operation, a lot of the key stuff is still at Jefferson.
Mark, you know, what an honor to meet Dr. Miller and to spend time with him. Talk to us about his relationship with Dr. Gibbon. Obviously, collegiality is something we expect, but did they truly have a collegial relationship?
Well, I'm afraid you've opened up a can of worms. There was a terrible falling out between Dr. Miller and Dr. Gibbon, and what it revolved around, it's almost worthy of another presentation, Al. Dr. Miller was chosen by some organization, and they credited him with inventing the heart-lung machine. Dr. Gibbon took great umbrage to that designation and was really quite annoyed. Their working relationship really went downhill. I think it's fair to say, and this has been corroborated by some of the witnesses that I interviewed, Dr. Gibbon rarely went to the animal laboratory. Dr. Miller did it all. He created ASDs, closed ASDs, created VSDs, closed VSDs in the dogs, and he was the one who worked tirelessly with the IBM engineers. So Dr. Miller, quite wistfully, when I met with him, he said, I really wanted to become a cardiac surgeon, but he was shut out by Dr. Gibbon, but did get an appointment in the Department of Anatomy at Jefferson, became a thoracic oncologic surgeon, continued to invent. He invented a hyperbaric chemotherapeutic device that was published in 1956, and again was a highly respected surgeon in the Philadelphia area, but he wasn't the only one to have had some interpersonal problems with Dr. Gibbon. And I'll leave it at that.
Mark, Gary Grist wants to know, did Dr. Gibbon ever have contact with Dr. Bruhenko? Apparently the Russian who invented the autoejector.
Not as far as I can tell. I think Dr. Bruhenko's work was really not appreciated for probably 50 years until somebody found it and translated the Russians' work. There's 1 or 2 articles in the Annals of Thoracic Surgery detailing all of Bruhenko's work, but they never, remember, the main person that Dr. Gibbon freely shared the technology with was Dr. John Kirkland. And as you all probably know, there was the so-called Mayo Gibbon heart-lung machine that was modified a bit by Dr. Kirkland and his engineers up at the Mayo Clinic, and that was really used quite successfully on a number of early cases in the mid-50s.
I want to thank everybody for the questions. Mark, we have one more question, if it's okay with you, and it's from Bob Groom. And you did state in the beginning of your talk that Dr. Gibbon only performed a few of these surgeries, and Bob said he understands that Dr. Gibbon abandoned the use. But after several subsequent failures, can you tell us the importance of successful cases? This is Bob's question. The importance of successful cases and the importance in encouraging other researchers, as you just meant, Dr. Kirkland, who took the Gibbon machine and modified it, are others that he influenced at that particular time who went on to serve as great individuals, either as surgeons or as perfusionists.
Well, persistence certainly is the name of the game, and there was never a patent on the Gibbon IBM heart-lung machine. He freely shared blueprints with other groups. I know Dr. Gibbon was criticized somewhat in some books for abandoning cardiac surgery. Dr. Miller always credited John Templeton, who really took up the cardiac surgery at Jefferson circa 1955, I believe, and was a fine surgeon. I spoke with Dr. Templeton, so I hope that answers what you were asking, Al.
Yes, absolutely. And we're at the top of the hour. Obviously, this is generated a tremendous amount of discussion and interest. Perhaps we'll invite Mark back and share some of it. He's done a lot of work on the history of safety in cardiac surgery and perfusion, and I'd love to have Mark present some of his groundbreaking work even to this day in safety. But I want to thank everybody, and I apologize if we didn't get to all your questions. Obviously, I'm going to show Mark's email address in just a second. But before I do, our next presentation is going to be on the importance of documentation during cardiopulmonary bypass. We're going to have the attorney, Deb Weinrich, is going to present. And just as a note, we normally have these webinars on Wednesday. This next one is moved to a Thursday just to facilitate her schedule. As I mentioned, Mark's email address is here. Jeff and mine are here for any logistical things. If you're not getting your credits or anything you need, please let us know. This will be posted on YouTube. Mark has given us permission. So I'm sure we'll go back and I know I'm going back to listen to it in more greater detail. But I want to thank Mark for this outstanding presentation, for all the work he's done, for what you've done for the field of perfusion over the past 40 plus years. I'd like to thank Jeff for his co-moderation, and of course, Maggie Ring for organizing the webinar. So with that, I wish everybody a pleasant evening and look forward to future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Al. Thank you, everybody. Good night.